Good morning, and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue now our reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. And I want to back up a little bit and reiterate some things that we passed over without comment yesterday on the program, reminding the listeners that R.W. Thompson is relating to us how the papacy and the Jesuits view our public school systems. They view them as heretical, as unchristian schools, simply because they do not teach Roman Catholic tenets. They do not teach union of church and state. They teach the separation of church and state. They do not teach that the Pope is the voice of God on earth. They do not teach that all men should be subject to the Roman Pontiff. They do not teach that the governments of the world should be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And all these schools, these public schools, are heretical. The Pope believes that the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church should be the main instruction, and that union of church and state and that papal superiority, temporal and spiritual supremacy and autonomy and irresponsibility should be taught in the schools. What should be taught in the public schools is that men are not to govern themselves or to form governments of and by and for the people, but should resist, openly resist, and overthrow those forms of government. Essentially, the Roman Catholic Church says that the public school systems are not godly schools because they're Protestant schools. Now, this is what was being promoted by Monsignor Sotoli and Pope Leo XIII. And obviously, the Jesuits, who were assigned by the Roman Catholic Church, by the papacy, to be the instructors of all children, they wanted control of the public school systems. And barring that, to create parochial schools to teach Roman Catholicism and against Protestant education. Now, even though in the schools, as they are now, no religious favoritism is preached, is taught. Rome still equates the public school system to be heretical because it does not promote Catholicism. Now, beginning in the first full paragraph on page 404, R.W. Thompson says, if, however, the pupils of these papal schools, these parochial schools that were created as a remedy for the public schools, in other words, schools available for Roman Catholic children to attend, to be taught Romanism, popery, that these schools, if the pupils of these schools should indicate the suspicion that these official proclamations of Roman Catholic doctrine by by Pius IX and Leo XIII had not the sanction of earlier popes, their teachers, especially if they are Jesuits, will take delight in instructing them that these two last popes, Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII, at the foot of the list of popes, are following strictly in the footsteps of some of the most conspicuous of their predecessors. R.W. Thompson envisions that these Jesuits would step in and say, Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius IX are true popes, teaching the true doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, that the schools are to be run by the Jesuits, and that Roman Catholic doctrine should be taught in the schools by divine right. Now it says, and then they will dwell eloquently upon the magnificent pontificates of Pope Gregory VII, Alexander III, Innocent III, and Boniface VIII, and others equally ambitious, but of less strength and will, as Pope Pius IX and Leo XIII were. Now the task will be an easy one to explain the history of these great popes and the political religious principles they succeeded in grafting upon the dogmas of the church. They will instruct them how Pope Gregory VII plucked the crowns from the heads of disobedient kings, released their subjects from their allegiance, and placed other and obedient kings in their places. Remember, the Pope is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You occupy a position of king in this world, and if you defy the papacy can take you out. I say they can JFK any king of the world that defies the papacy. History is copiously prominent with assassinations of presidents and kings and potentates who defied the spiritual or the temporal authority of the popes. Now, it says also how he claimed the right as pope to dispose of kingdoms, to overthrow kingdoms, because, quote, the spiritual power is above the temporal power, unquote, to so great an extent that all the people should, quote, should murder their princes, their fathers, and their children if he commands it, unquote, and how he made monarchs, princes, and peoples tremble before him as if he, by virtue alone of his pontifical power, were master of the world. He shakes kingdoms. He is, as it were, God on earth. Now let me read a passage from the Scriptures. If this hasn't rung familiar with some of my listeners, the Bible makes this language familiar. Now remember, in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 14, Satan gives his 5 I wills. The Bible says, beginning in verse 12, this is God speaking. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. The 5 I wills of Satan. And God immediately answers Satan. He says, yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. Now listen to the language as God continues. He says, they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? This is describing the papacy, the man who represents Satan in the world. Who is that man? It's the papacy, with the help of the Jesuit order, that shakes kingdoms, that overthrows nations, makes the earth to tremble. That is the fulfillment of this, the materialization of this is clearly visible in history. It's the papacy. And I just wanted my listeners to recognize that what we're reading about here in the histories of Gregory VII, Alexander III, Innocent III, Boniface VIII, Pope Pius IX, Gregory XIII, or Gregory XVI, and Pope Leo XIII, and all the popes. No pope renounced any of these so-called dogmas that were imposed upon the Roman Catholic Church by the popes. Nobody repudiated them. All the popes bear responsibility for these blasphemies of the popes. The Roman Catholic Church bears the responsibility. Individual Roman Catholics bear the responsibility for not repudiating the blasphemies of the papacy, in arrogating to itself the right to seat and unseat kings, as though he were the King of Kings, and to be the Lord of Lords, even Lord over Jesus Christ. They all bear the responsibility. Even you and I bear the responsibility if we do not denounce Antichrist for what he is. There should not be one man, woman, or child on this planet that is ignorant about what role the papacy plays in the world. Europe certainly wasn't ignorant after the Protestant Reformation. So why the ignorance today? It's simply because Protestantism has failed in its mission to the world. Now, with all that ignorance now prevailing, with all that Protestant indifference, the papacy now has a clear slate to disavow itself of its own history and to declare that Protestantism is dead. And now that the world's recognizing that and accepting that, as they did at Vatican Council II, must restore the Pope's godlike status in the world as a matter of religious faith and dogma. So the Jesuits, who the Roman Catholic Church has given the responsibility of teaching in the schools and in the churches, church and state, are going to boast about these most ambitious popes, saying that Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII were just the greatest of the great, and they want to build Roman Catholic schools if they can't take over and control the public schools. Okay? It says, and they will show them how Alexander III released the German people from their allegiance to Frederick Barbarossa and compelled that proud emperor to kiss his foot, the foot of the Pope, the foot of the Antichrist. How he compelled him to lead his horse by the bridle and submit to having the papal heel planted upon his neck. And how Pope Innocent III declared, how Pope Innocent III declared by solemn pontifical decree that the English Magna Carta was null and void because it laid the foundation of popular liberty. Let me add the word Protestant liberty, and excommunicated all who were concerned in the patriotic work of obtaining it. And how Pope Boniface VIII, Antichrist Pope Boniface VIII, decreed in his bull, Claricis Laicus, that lay governments, in other words, governments that were occupied by non-Roman Catholic priests. See, the Pope says the Pope through his priests should be the government of every nation. That every member of the government should be led and directed by the Roman Catholic priest, because the spiritual is higher than the temporal, that the church is higher than the state. So in this papal bull by Boniface VIII, he says that lay governments, civil governments, quote, have no power over the persons or the property of ecclesiastics, that is, the priests and the Pope, the church, no power over them. And that those who shall impose tithes, taxes, and burdens upon them without the authority of the Pope, quote, shall incur excommunication, unquote. And how he also decreed by his bull Unum Sanctum that the church, that is, the Pope, holds in her hands both the spiritual and the temporal swords, with the power to compel the latter to be used for it, to be used for and in the interest of the former. That the temporal sword is therefore, quote, subject to the spiritual power, unquote, and that it is, quote, an article of necessary faith. In other words, dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, that every human being should be subject to the Roman pontiff. See, the Jesuits will just chomp at the bit if it is ever needed to boast about these Antichrist popes as the best example of the popes, and that Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII were the best of the best, and demanded that the school systems in this country be overturned into Roman Catholic schools at the command of the Pope. Now, this is where we left off yesterday, and I just want you to know that this is fulfillment of Bible prophecy. This is Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 through the end as fulfillment. We see in the man, the papacy, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the one who exalts himself above the stars of God, who fulfills the 5 I wills of Satan in the world. The world calls him the vicar of Christ. He's not the vicar of Christ. He's the vicar of Satan himself. He fulfills Satan's false prophecy. And there's no other institution, no other man, no other succession of men that better fulfills the five I wills of Satan than does the papacy. And this knowledge was what was so solid among the Protestant reformers. Unanimously, they saw what I've just described to you. And they protested this man of sin, this son of perdition, this Antichrist of Rome, the papacy, and all that it stood for. And out of that Protestant Reformation came our own government. Separation of church and state, so that the Pope cannot rule over the people. The non-establishment clause, the government will not establish any particular religion. The religion of the people is up to the people, up to the Bible, up to their consciences. The government of the United States is not to cross paths with the spiritual, the true spiritual, not the counterfeit in Rome. Now, R.W. Thompson continues, it requires but little intelligence to see wherein the differences consist between these two systems of education, the public school system and the parochial school system, the Roman Catholic school system, the one expanding and the other dwarfing the intellect. I'll let my listeners decide which one expands the intellect and which one dwarfs the intellect. If, however, each improve the intellect alike, the public schools are entitled to the preference for the reason that they instill into the minds of the pupils the great fundamental principles upon which our government is founded, whereas those who attend the papal schools are instructed that the most essential of these principles are the fruitful source of heresies and consequently of ills to the human family. The two systems, therefore, remain in conflict, just as they have hitherto been. And the great question the present generation is called upon to decide is, which shall triumph? I will just add, from the Bible, choose you this day who you will serve. Will you serve Christ, or will you serve Antichrist? If you serve Christ, then liberty will prevail. True righteousness and justice will prevail. A man will be elevated to have a law burning in his heart. But if you choose Antichrist, a man will be reduced to an automaton of the Pope, will be completely emasculated, and simply be a slave and a subject, doing, thinking, and saying whatever is put upon him by the papacy. Now, with those of us who desire, says R.W. Thompson, to maintain our popular form of government, our Protestant form of government, this question does not involve religious faith. But with the defenders of the papacy and followers of the Pope, it does. And consequently, those who are willing to form a political religious party, as they have formed during the ecumenical movement, Catholics and evangelibellies together, pledged to restore the temporal power of the Pope, even at the possible hazard of a war with Italy, and I would say now Iraq, Iran, Syria, or anybody else that won't go along with this Pope's New World Order, and entangling alliances with other European powers, are promised a crown of eternal glory, while those who are seeking to maintain our Protestant institutions, as our fathers framed them, are anathematized for the sin of rebellion against papal authority. That's the end of the chapter. I want my listeners to know what position the papacy takes against the legitimate form of our government, the entire form of our government, and to understand the motivations by which the Roman Catholics of this country, in obedience to their priests, their Jesuit mentors, their papal pretense in Rome, are seeking systematically, gradually, ever so perpetually to overthrow every vestige of Protestantism in this country, even to the point of overthrowing the entire government and imposing upon us a papal monarchy the old world order restored. Now, chapter 22 of the book is entitled Jesuitical Teachings. R.W. Thompson relates, inasmuch as Pope Leo XIII has considered himself entitled by virtue of his spiritual power, pretended spiritual power, I will add, to prescribe authoritatively the relations which his followers in this country are hereafter to sustain to our system of public school education, it is proper for us to inquire wherein the system he proposes to have introduced differs from our own. In this way, we shall not only be able to understand the contrast between them, but discover why he gives the preference to the papal or Jesuit system. At the beginning of this inquiry, we are relieved from any trouble by his biographer, who tells us that while Cardinal Pecci, quote, drew up in 1858 a constitution and rules for the Academy of Thomas Aquinas, which was to extend its benefits to the whole of Umbria. I see we've come up on the break. We'll get back to this when we return. Inquisition update on First Amendment Radio. Stay tuned.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
All right, now, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you wish to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, Chapter 22 of the book, Jesuitical Teachings. What forms the basis, or who is responsible for what the Jesuits teach the youth? What kind of philosophy do they follow? Who is their example? Where's the source of all their so-called wisdom? R.W. Thompson's going to reveal that. He says, inasmuch as Pope Leo XIII has considered himself entitled, by virtue of his spiritual power, to prescribe authoritatively the relations which his followers, Roman Catholics, in this country, are hereafter to sustain or to impose upon our system of public school education, it is proper for us to inquire wherein the system he proposes to have introduced differs from our own. How does this Jesuitical system of education differ from our own? In this way, we shall not only be able to understand the contrast between them, but discover why he gives the preference to the papal or the Jesuit system. At the beginning of this inquiry, we are relieved from any trouble by his biographer, who tells us that while Cardinal, Pope Leo XIII, quote, drew up in 1858 a constitution and rules for the Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, which was to extend its benefits to the whole of Umbria. All right? He started this academy for Thomas Aquinas, a university, teaching Thomistic theology, Thomistic philosophies. And he imposed it upon the whole of Umbria to make Umbria Catholic so that it would help defend the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope in Italy and come to the rescue of the Pope to reinstall him as the King of Kings in Italy, to overthrow the Victor Emmanuel government and the Republic established by the people of Italy in rebellion against the papacy. Well, who did the Pope rely upon? Yes, the Jesuits, but what philosophy did the Pope rely upon to strengthen Umbria so that it would man itself to come to Italy to help overthrow the Victor Emmanuel government? It says he drew up in 1558 a constitution and rules for an academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, which was to extend its benefits to the whole of Umbria. All the Thomistic teaching were to benefit Umbria. and ultimately to benefit the papacy. And that since he became Pope, he has, quote, made the philosophical method of St. Thomas Aquinas the guide of all Catholic teachers. So every Roman Catholic teacher, every Jesuit is well schooled in the philosophies and the theologies of Thomas Aquinas. And obviously the strategy would be to impose Thomistic thinking to the teachers of the public school systems as well, to strengthen America, to help restore the temporal power of the Pope in America. Now, Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century, long before the Protestant Reformation, when the world was shrouded in the almost total darkness of the Middle Ages, and when obedience to despotic rulers, both spiritual and temporal, was considered the highest duty of life. Church and state were united, and the former governed the latter with a rod of iron. Liberty of thought was suppressed by faggot and flame. That's history, real history. Anyone who thought for themselves, anyone who was considered a critical thinker, as we say today, or a free spirit, or a Protestant, they were suppressed by faggot and flame. A faggot is a stake in the ground, and a flame is fire. Now, he was a voluminous writer, mostly on theological subjects, and as he treated these in accordance with the system maintained by the popes, from whom all authority emanated, he was called the angel of the schools, angelic doctor, eagle of the theologians, and holy doctor. He was canonized in 1323, about 50 years after his death, by John the 22nd, the second of the popes who reigned at Avignon in France at the time when, according to the historian Dementor, quote, the church languished in fearful anarchy, unquote. These circumstances do not conspire to show his fitness as a guide for any system of modern education, especially that existing in the United States. The theology of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, which he vindicated, filled the world with superstition. And now, after the ignorance of that period has been dispelled by the light of the Protestant Reformation, there are none who desire to see this superstition and ignorance revived, except those who, like Pope Leo XIII, consider the times before this light began to shine as the quote-unquote blessed ages. This reverend biographer of Pope Leo XIII says that the, quote, false education and anti-Christian training, unquote, of the young, which prevails in the United States and among the liberal and progressive peoples of the world, I will add the word, the Protestant peoples of the world, must be done away with, abandoned. And quote, Thomas Aquinas must once more be enthroned as the angel of the schools. His method and doctrine must be the light of all higher teaching. For his works are only revealed truth set before the human mind in its most scientific form, unquote. So this is the absolute ultimate experience for Roman Catholic education, to teach Thomistic theology and Thomistic philosophy. Thomas Aquinas. It says this prominence was not given to the doctrines of Aquinas as, quote-unquote, revealed truth without due consideration of their importance to the papacy. That's right. The reason Thomas Aquinas is elevated to a god in education, an angelic teacher, an angelic doctor, is because his philosophies and teachings were so advantageous to the Pope, to the papacy, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. He says they were especially taught in the schools of Umbria under the auspices of Leo XIII. When he was archbishop, and since he became pope, he has made them the universal guide of the, quote, Catholic teachers throughout the world. In addition to the command of Ignatius Loyola, in obedience to the command of Ignatius Loyola himself, the founder of the Jesuit order, in his lifetime, they were also made, quote, the basis of the entire curriculum of philosophy and divinity, unquote, in all Jesuit colleges and schools, and have thereby become an absolutely necessary and indispensable part of Jesuit education. So when you think of a Jesuit education, and many of our most powerful public leaders in the world today are Jesuit educated, they come from Jesuit schools and universities, they have been soaked to the skin with Thomistic theology and philosophy. He says, it is thus made entirely clear that whatsoever else Pope Leo XIII may or may not have accomplished during his pontificate, he has authoritatively commanded that the doctrines of Thomas Aquinas shall be instilled into the minds of all, both young and old, who may be brought under the influence of the papal system of education in the United States as well as elsewhere. It is by this system, therefore, that he proposes to supplant our common schools, so that the end sought after by Ignatius Loyola himself, the overthrow of Protestantism and the elevation of the papacy to global supremacy, may be accomplished. That is, the destruction of all popular governments, Protestant governments, governments of, by, and for the people, who are now the temples of the Holy Spirit of Almighty God. This is warfare against God himself. He says it will require only a brief examination of these doctrines to explain fully the purpose of Pope Leo XIII in making them an indispensable part of Roman Catholic education in the United States, as well as to show that the papal theory of civil government is founded upon them as, quote, unquote, revealed truth. They say Thomas Aquinas was given divine instruction in education, theology, and philosophy. And Thomas Aquinas is the go-to guy for the Jesuits. Now, it says in the first chapter of this volume, reference was made to Balmas, a Spanish priest who achieved the reputation of being, quote, the boast of the Spanish clergy, unquote, and the ablest defender of the Jesuit doctrines, the Thomas Aquinas doctrines of the Jesuits. His mind was well stored with the philosophical teachings of Thomas Aquinas, to the study of which he devoted a number of years, adopting the interpretation put upon them in the commentaries of Bellarmine and Suarez, both of whom were Jesuit priests. He died in 1848, about the breaking out of the great revolutions among the Roman Catholic populations of Europe, which were due strictly to the Protestant Reformation. Remember, the Catholic nations followed the example, at least partially, of the Protestant reformers in that they overthrew their papal monarchs. They overthrew the temporal power of the Pope, and they formed their own governments, where the people's rights were preserved in constitutions and bills of rights. Okay? He died in 1848, about the time of the breaking out of the great revolutions among the Roman Catholic populations of Europe. But before that time had occupied himself in earnest efforts to turn back the tide which then threatened to overwhelm the papacy. His principal work designed for this purpose was intended, as stated in the first chapter, to counteract the influences of Guizot's treatise on civilization, which had produced very perceptible impressions upon the most enlightened minds of Europe in favor of Protestantism over Roman Catholicism. So Protestantism had a philosopher as well, and it was Guizot, according to R.W. Thompson. And it says his special object, therefore, was to demonstrate that the reverse of what Guizot insisted upon was true, and that Roman Catholicism was the real source of all existing enlightenment and civilization. Having written entirely from the Jesuit standpoint, his arguments with regard to the obligation of obedience to the laws of civil governments were based entirely upon the doctrines of the quote-unquote holy doctor, Thomas Aquinas, and it says this may be justifiably inferred from what he says in highly eulogistic praise of him near the close of his work. The doctrines he sets forth are commended to the people of the United States in the preface to the American edition of his work, where it is said that he has exposed, quote, the shortcomings, or rather the evils of Protestantism in a social and political point of view, unquote, and that, quote, the Protestant, if sincere, will open his eyes to the incompatibility of his principles with the happiness of mankind, unquote. As this learned work has been extensively circulated in this country for the purpose here expressed, we are justified in accepting its doctrines and teachings in both social and political points of view as accurately expressing the opinions of Thomas Aquinas with regard to the right of civil governments to require obedience to their laws from all who live under them. And it is necessary for us to know and fully understand what these doctrines of Thomas Aquinas are in order to become familiar with the, quote, curriculum and philosophy and divinity, unquote, in Jesuit colleges and schools, and with the principles authoritatively prescribed by Pope Leo XIII as, quote, the guide for all Catholic teachers, unquote. When we shall have accomplished this, we shall be better able to decide whether or no it would be prudent and wise to exchange the course of studies now prosecuted in our public schools for this papal and Jesuitical curriculum, whether our American schools should be presided over by the spirit of the sainted and quote-unquote holy doctor, or remain as they are, under the care, protection, and patronage of the American people. Balmas quotes Thomas Aquinas to prove that, quote, human laws, if they are just, are binding in conscience and derive their power from the eternal law from which they are formed, unquote. So far, so good, right? Listen further. But he makes their justice to depend entirely upon their conformity to the divine law. In other words, applying his doctrine practically, as the Pope possesses the only legitimate power upon earth to decide what the divine law allows and what it condemns. Therefore, to him alone must the justice or injustice of all human laws be submitted, and his decision, when made, is final and must be universally obeyed. So, Thomas Aquinas likened the divine law to whatever the Pope says, whatever the Pope's decree. That's the divine law. And that civil governments must not tread upon the divine law. And whatever law the Pope says is unjust is ipso facto overthrown. And, of course, the law of the United States, the Constitution of the United States, says the people shall rule. Well, that's not what it says in the quote-unquote divine law, which you must understand is not the Bible. It's Roman Catholic canon law. You see, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist likes to sit in God's throne, or pretend to sit in God's throne. Now, what is God himself if he is not a lawgiver? That's what he is, a law. And so the Pope, imitating as cheaply as he possibly can what God is, he becomes, too, a lawgiver. claims himself to be the representative of God on earth, but his laws do not square with the real divine law. That's what makes him Antichrist. Now, Thomas Aquinas places all the importance of the law upon the papacy, and so do all Roman Catholic historians, and so do the Jesuits, who are bathed in Thomistic teaching and who insist that they are the only legitimate teachers of the children in this world. Now, R.W. Thompson continues, he says, hence the obligation of obedience relates only to those laws which the Pope shall decide to be just, while those he shall decide to be unjust shall be disregarded or resisted, or where open resistance is impractical, may be plotted against and overthrown in whatsoever mode is most expedient. In order to illustrate and give emphasis to his meaning, he asks the question, quote, are we to obey the civil power when it commands something that is evil in itself? The answer, he says, quote, no, we are not, for the simple reason that what is evil is forbidden by God. Now we must obey God rather than man, unquote. He then supplements, this is the kicker. See, you always have to look for the kicker when a Roman Catholic is teaching. It says, and this limitation upon the civil power he explains further by affirming that the spiritual power of the Roman Catholic Church, which is lodged exclusively in the hands of the Pope, who stands in the place of God, has always served to, quote, remind men that the rights of the civil power are limited, that there are things beyond its province, cases in which a man may say and ought to say, I will not obey. So if you're paying attention, you simply can only come to one conclusion. You must obey the Pope. He is not a man, but God. And any government of men can be overthrown by the Pope and should be disobeyed and overthrown by his subjects. And this defines history. And nowhere more so dramatically than in England, where the popes repeatedly exonerated the people from any oath that they may have taken to the legitimate government of England, the Protestant government of England, and rose up a civil war to unseat the Protestant king or queen at the time. And they committed no sin according to the Pope. They were doing God's word, God's will, the Pope's will in England. All we have to do is look at the examples of history to define and to understand what the Pope has in store for this country. There's nothing new under the sun. This is why this history has been virtually eliminated from the schools, the common schools, the public school system in this country. So we not know what Rome has in store for this government, this Protestant government. He says the application of this doctrine, and thus laid down by the quote-unquote holy doctor, affirmed by Balmus and stamped with pontifical sanction by Pope Leo XIII, to the condition of affairs under our civil institutions is plain and simple and easily understood. It is unnecessary to repeat at this point the fundamental principles of our government which Leo XIII, Pope Pius IX, Gregory XVI, and numerous other popes have condemned and anathematized as heretical and violative of the divine law, that is, Roman Catholic canon law. According to their pontifical teachings, announced ex cathedra, which means from the chair of Peter, wrapped in infallibility, the American Constitution and laws which require obedience to any of these or all of them not only require, quote, something that is evil, unquote, but transcends the faculties of the government by encroaching upon those which God has made to pertain exclusively to the Roman Catholic Church or to the Pope as its divinely instituted head. Therefore, according to Thomas Aquinas and Balmus and Pope Leo XIII and to the Jesuits, they are not to be obeyed because, quote, God rather than man, unquote, must be obeyed. You see how the Pope has elevated himself above the stars of God? He says Pope Leo XIII is not, of course, bound as an alien and spiritual ruler of the Church to obey them, but by requiring that these doctrines shall be taught in all Roman Catholic schools in the United States, he assumes the spiritual and prerogative right to require of all in this country who obey his teachings to violate their allegiance to the government because it maintains these sinful and unjust constitutions and laws. This is perfectly logical, as palpable as that 2 and 2 make 4. But Balmus, still following Thomas Aquinas, does not stop here. He repeats that unjust laws are, quote, not binding on the conscience.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.